a hospital bed was 17. He was about to begin his senior year of high school. "I wanted to be a Marine," he said. "It's the only thing I've ever wanted to be." But that was no longer in his future. A motorcycle accident had cost him his leg, and he would never be among the few, the proud, and the brave. Although the loss of his leg was devastating, in that moment, he was mourning the loss of his future story, one that he had carefully crafted for himself, which included a career serving his country in the military. All of that was dashed to pieces as he lay there in that bed. I had been called to this young man's room at the beginning of my on-call shift during my clinical pastoral education, my chaplaincy internship, and I was faced with his devastation head-on. The primary question in the room that night was, why? Why do bad things happen to good people? That question, why, reminds me of the biblical story of Job, which tells us of a man who was the most righteous in all the land. He was honest, he was good, he obeyed all of God's commands, and he believed that God had rewarded him for his righteousness because he was wealthy, he had a beautiful wife, and he had many children. But one day, God takes back everything that Job had been given. His children were dead, his animals and crops were gone, his house burned, his health failing. Job's friends, believing that Job must be responsible in some way for these calamities, try to find the reason. They believe that God hands out blessings to the good and punishments to the evil, and these horrible things happening to Job must certainly have a cause. But Job insists that he has done nothing wrong. And he cries out to God. He calls him unfair. And God finally speaks back. "Where were you when I created the world?" The truth of the matter is that Job cannot understand God's ways. Now, when I first read Job, I was appalled at God's behavior. And I was not a fan of this story. The idea of a God that plays puppet with innocent people is creepy at best. But it is, I believe, the closest story in the Bible that comes closest to illustrating the random tragedies in our world. When I was born, I was very premature, and I was very sick, and my parents were crushed. So someone recommended a book to my mother entitled "Why Bad Things Happen to Good People" by Rabbi Harold Kushner. And my mother felt relief, thinking someone had written a book to explain this conundrum. So she went to the bookstore and she found the book. Unfortunately, the title had been misunderstood. It's called "When Bad Things Happen." I can only imagine the disappointment that my mother felt in that moment. Because try as we might, we do not know why. But one day or another, the when will come. Bad things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Bad things happen. The future stories that we create for ourselves, be they relationships or families or careers or other hopes, they will not remain unchanged. And it's not fair. It is not fair. Job's friends tried to figure out why Job's fortunes have shifted so drastically. The young man in the hospital bed asked me, his chaplain, why God had caused this to happen. Crying with him, I could only say, the ways of the world are beyond our understanding. And it really sucks, doesn't it? He nodded. Historically, we Unitarian Universalists have often relied on our wits, our status, or our reason to think our way out of a problematic situation. But sometimes we just can't think our way out of a bad time. Sometimes there is no logical explanation. Sometimes it seems as if we are being challenged with the question, where were you when the world was created? I am reminded of another biblical story, one which is particularly relevant this week as we enter into the Christian Holy Week to honor the last week of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. This week includes today, Palm Sunday, as well as Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and of course, next Sunday, Easter Sunday. This is, in the Christian calendar, the holiest week of the year. But if we look for a moment at the story, at face value, without the centuries of accumulated meaning, this is a story of a very bad thing happening to a very good man. Jesus himself cries out to God. He is recorded as asking God to take away the cup that he bears. Jesus is frightened. He feels abandoned by his friends. In his last hour on that Friday on the cross, he cries out to God, asking why he has been forsaken. Why? The loneliness, fear, and even despair that Jesus and his followers must have felt on that Friday 2 millennia ago was probably overwhelming. Their hope of Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the one that would overthrow the reign of the Romans and restore God's rule over the kingdom of the Jews, was shattered. The future story that they had created was gone. And those of us with the benefit of hindsight know how this story goes. We know that their hope was restored. We know that life followed death, that light shined again. But in that moment at Golgotha, all they could see was dark. To our earliest human ancestors, long before that tragic week in Jerusalem, the cycles of the earth were also a thing to be revered and to be feared. In Europe, the Germanic peoples, who later came to be known as pagans, which, by the way, just means country dwellers in Latin, the pagans developed an elaborate calendar of rituals and ceremonies to honor the seasons and the cycles of the earth. They honored the sun above all else, and the winter time seemed to them to be a time of absence. The sun had abandoned them, leaving them in the cold and the dark without crops or hope. But the springtime brought with it new life and the promise of rebirth. They believed that the goddess Ostara, the bringer of fertility, came at this time to spread life and color and to mate with the solar god, to conceive a child who would be born 9 months later on the winter equinox. That child would begin to bring back the light. These myths and stories helped organize the world of the ancients to have faith in times of darkness and despair. The earth taught them that life always follows death, that the two are always intertwined. And then the early Christians began to celebrate Easter, perhaps in conjunction with the celebration of Ostara. Their Lenten season of penance and fasting and preparation helped them to honor the darkness and the sadness in life, in order to celebrate the new life that returns at Easter. Interestingly, they also celebrated the birth of a special son 9 months later, the bringer of light to the dark world. The Christians found meaning in the natural cycles, and they used these celebrations to enhance their message of hope.